Well, good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening from wherever in the world you may be joining us. My name is Jeroen Dewulf. I'm the director of the UC Berkeley Institute of European Studies. I'd like to welcome all of you to today's event that is co-organized with our partner institution, the German Historical Institute. This is what we call a rapid response event, an event where we react with our team here at IES to a special occurrence in Europe, in this case, a very important one, the federal elections in Germany. And I welcome to today's event two of my colleagues, our Associate Director, Akasemi Newsome, as well as Soeren Urbansky, who's the head of office of the West Coast branch of the German Historical Institute in Washington, D.C. The way today's event will be organized is that we will start with Akasemi Newsome, who will present to us the results of the elections and will also say a few words about possible coalition governments and give us some background on the results of the election. And after that, I will have a brief follow-up conversation with Soeren about the results of the main parties and the most likely candidate to succeed to Angela Merkel as the new Chancellor of Germany. After that, we will have a chance to also discuss questions from the audience. So during the first part of the presentation, all of you are encouraged to post your own questions in the chat function on Zoom. And then we will discuss a selection of these questions in the second part of the event. I do want to ask people in the audience to please mute yourself and turn off personal videos during our event. But let me pass it on here to my colleague Akasemi to give us some background on the results of the election. Akasemi, the floor is yours. Akasemi, you're muted. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much, Jeroen, for that great introduction to our event. Can all of you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay. So as many of you have heard, and as Jeroen mentioned, yesterday on the 26th of September, the federal elections in Germany took place. And in this slide, just showing the major contenders for the position of chancellor or head of government. To look at the results in an upset, the SPD, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, was able to increase the number of seats that it had since the last election in parliament. Angela Merkel's party, the Christian Democratic Union, the CDU, CSU, in partnership with the Bavarian sister party, Christian Socialist Union, lost many seats in the Bundestag. The Greens were able to increase their share in the parliament significantly, as was the Liberal Party, the Free Democratic Party, Freie Demokratische Partei, the FDP. The far right party, the Alternative for Germany, the AfD, lost seats in this election, as did the left party. Now, with this slide, I think it's really useful to see in more detail and unpack a bit the differences between the 2017 election and the 2021 election. And there you can see just how much the Christian Democrats reduced their hold in parliament, going from 32.9% in 2017 down to 24.1%. As of last night. The SPD, as you can see, surprised many by becoming the largest party effectively in parliament. The Greens, you can see, increased from 8.9% to 14.8% between the two cycles, the FDP, the left party, and so on. Now, because no single party has a majority of seats this will by definition be a coalition government with three parties. And on this slide, I have Germany's next chancellor with a question mark. Even though the SPD has the greatest sort of share of seats in parliament, the CDU candidate for the chancellor, Armin Laschet, has also declared his intent to form a government with two other parties. So it seems quite likely that the SPD will be the leading partner in a government, but because you have the two parties seeking with talks with the smaller parties to form a majority, I do have to put that question mark there. So as you've probably seen on many headlines, these two are known as the kingmakers. That's Annalena Baerbock, who was the Green Party candidate for the chancellorship, and Christian Lindner, who is the Liberal candidate for the chancellorship. As both parties did so well, they effectively will be decisive in terms of determining whether the government will be SPD-led or CDU-led. Now, what is the likelihood of that? Here are some possible German government coalitions that may emerge from weeks or even months of coalition talks. As you can see, there is, for example, at the top, the traffic light coalition, where it's the SPD, the Greens, and the Liberals together, bringing them over the threshold of 368 seats in parliament to form a majority. Another possibility is the Jamaica coalition, signified by the matching of the colors to the Jamaican flag, where the CDU, the Green Party, and the Liberals together form a government. Commentators and scholars suggest that that coalition may be less likely because the Greens and the CDU disagree so strongly on climate change policy. But this is something that will be up for discussion through the rest of this panel and with you, our audience. There's also the possibility of another grand coalition, something we've all been we've had a lot of experience with, given that that was how Merkel governed most recently, where you have the CDU in partnership with the SPD. A red-red-green coalition would not bring them to the threshold of a majority. This would be a minority government and a weak government with the SPD, Left Party, and the Green Party, and then a black-green party with just the CDU, and the Green Party would be even more unstable. It's interesting to just consider briefly how different the youth or first-time voters looked from their older counterparts, in which rather than going sort of consistently for the SPD and the CDU, the Liberals and the Greens really took the highest percentages of the youth vote. This was also an exciting election in Germany because you had many candidates of a migration background, a non-white background, people of color running for office and participating as voters. We don't yet know the number of parliamentarians that will have a migrant background in the Bundestag, but in the last seating of 709 parliamentarians, 58 had a migration background in the parliament. This politician, Yeon Ri, is the first woman of Korean background to be elected to the Bundestag, and she sort of won her election for the district of Aachen. Now I will turn it over to you, Jeroen.
Thank you, Akasemi, for this very helpful introduction. And we do have a chance, me and Soeren, to talk a little bit more about the results before we open the floor for questions from the audience. And what I would suggest, Soeren, is that we start with a brief reflection on the results of the two main parties. And then we say a few words about the smaller parties, and then we end with a brief discussion on possible coalitions. But let me start with a very simple question to you, Soeren. Who could have thought, right, only 3 months ago, that the SPD, the Social Democrats, would win these elections? Do you agree with me that this, looking back, it's quite astonishing, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I think, first of all, hello, everyone, and thanks for having me. And I think it has been quite a roller coaster ride over the past few months. For when the parties announced the candidates, it was for some moment likely that actually the Green candidate will be become the chancellor, that is Annalena Baerbock. And then for a long time, it looked as if Armin Laschet, the CDU candidate, would be heading the new government, and now it is Olaf Scholz. And I think there's several reasons for that. I don't know whether we should go into details right now.
Maybe yes, because
okay.
Looking at follow-up questions after the results came out,
sure.
And what I found very interesting is that people were asked, why did you vote SPD? Right? Why did you vote for the Social Democratic Party? And what surprised me is that over 50% of the people said, I voted for this party because of Scholz. Yeah. So it clearly seems that the candidate they had as their presumed candidate to become Chancellor of Germany played a very important role here. So maybe for the audience, if you could tell a little bit more about Scholz, about his background, and why do you think he ended up being the most convincing candidate?
Well, Olaf Scholz is the only person among those three that had experience in a federal government as a Minister of Finance, which is obviously a very important ministry, and as the Vice Chancellor. He also ran a government in Hamburg, in the city of Hamburg. So he has been the most experienced candidate, whereas the Annalena Baerbock from the Green Party has never been part of any government in any state or any federal government. So, and Armin Laschet has been the head of state of the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, which is the biggest state in Germany, but he has had no federal level experience. And I would say, well, there's several reasons why people like Scholz. And the biggest reason is they dislike the other candidates. So it's not necessarily his strength, but the weakness of the others. But what he made strong and clear is that he is, well, let me put it, the male Merkel. So he's like the successor also in the style of making politics. Not so much like, he's not very charismatic. He's actually a good, like rhetorically, probably a better speaker than Merkel, but he's, in a way, he presents himself very calm, very, moderating, rather than, being forward and contra other people. So he's trying to form coalitions in a way. And I think that is what has been appreciated by Germans, although you could also argue that he's quite boring in that sense. But I think that has been the most appealing part of his personality. And Armin Laschet has made many mistakes during the election campaign. I mean, there's really like minimal things like, for instance, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, the president of Germany, held a speech during the floodings in Western Germany, and he was seen in the background. And while he was very, talking about this really serious, devastating flood, he was joking in the background, and everybody could see it on live, on air, and many other kind of missteps and mishaps. And people just thought he's not able to run this government and to kind of represent also Germany abroad. And for Annalena Baerbock, I would say many people thought she's too young, too unexperienced. Yeah, I think that, and also there were some faults on the campaign of the Green, or shortcomings. For instance, her CV was kind of, not fake, but a bit overdone. Like it said, she was working for the United Nations at some point, but she was just an intern there, and things like that. And then she had there were issues of plagiarism in a book she recently published, and these are things that don't go well with the German electorate, so to speak.
Credibility issue. Maybe we can go back to when we talk about smaller parties, but let me stay a little bit with SPD and CDU at this point. So you mentioned Laschet, right? The campaign didn't go well for him, but there's a history there as well, right? We know that Merkel, had thoughts about her successor and who that might be, and then of course things happened. We could see that Ursula von der Leyen, which was a potential successor for her, went to lead the EU Commission. Then there was the case of Kamp-Karrenbauer, who became head of the CDU. That didn't go well at all. There was a discussion with Markus Söder, the leader of the CSU in Bavaria. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that history and why ultimately one can say that Merkel was not successful in preparing, so to speak, her succession, right?
Well, first of all, one should perhaps mention that actually Merkel is the first chancellor that voluntarily steps down. Everybody else was voted out of government, basically. So she's the one that had the chance to say, okay, I'm not running again for chancellor this year, so I will kind of put up a person that can become my successor. And as you mentioned, she has been very unsuccessful. There have been several candidates: Ursula von der Leyen, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer. I mean, Ursula von der Leyen obviously made a career in the European Commission. But then after these two kind of candidates, female candidates again, one should mention, there was like a race of male candidates, and all from North Rhine-Westphalia, like the biggest or the most populous state in West Germany, in the west of Germany. And this kind of also set the tone within the party, I would say. They were not united behind any of the candidates, because like when they were having this vote, who would run or who would be head of party and also then candidate for chancellor, those votes were quite close. And his main opponent within the CDU was Friedrich Merz, who was very liberal, very pro-economy. But I think his biggest opponent was actually the head of the CSU and the head of state of Bavaria, Markus Söder, and he did not really support him. Actually, he kind of it was like a constant torpedoes being shot from Munich to Berlin against Armin Laschet, and this obviously did not help him with becoming chancellor as well. I did have a quick follow-up question also on Steinmeier. So because you brought up the president, right? And I think you agree with me in saying that he has excelled in his role as president of Germany. And he's, of course, of the same party that won the elections, the SPD, the Social Democrats. What is his role, you think? Did he have any impact on these results, that people, see the SPD as a serious party with good people who can govern this country? Well, Steinmeier is interesting because he had been a candidate for chancellor, I think 8 years ago, and he obviously Merkel won. But in the end, he became president of Germany. And usually, as I mentioned initially or in the beginning, the president does not play a decisive role in forming a government. He has no say in it. What happened last time, there was actually quite a long period, I think 4 months or 5 months even, after the elections while parties were negotiating. And it looked very likely that Jamaica, that is the Christian Democrats with the Liberals and the Green Party, will form a government, but then the Liberals kind of stepped out, and Steinmeier had to convince the Social Democrats to form a big coalition with the CDU again, which they were reluctant to do because they were the junior partner, and obviously often it is the case that the junior partner will lose votes during the next election. So his role was kind of reminding them of their responsibility, basically, as a party towards Germany, not as a party for the party politics, but for forming a stable government. And I would see his role in the next months in a similar way, but this time is a little different because the SPD is the strongest party, and he has a SPD, or used to have an SPD party book. So he was a member of the SPD, but every president has to kind of pause his party membership or her party membership and should be kind of neutral. But in a way, this is kind of difficult this time because he will run again for president in early next year, and it's the Bundestag, and well, not only the Bundestag but part of it who will vote for him. So actually he has an interest himself in being re-elected, so he cannot be really neutral. So that's going to be really interesting how he also himself will define his role in these months to come.
Yeah. Let us now switch to the smaller parties, and there's a reason for that, right? Because even the SPD being the party that won the elections today, if you look historically at these results, 25% is actually not that much. I only think twice in the history of the party had less than what it obtained in terms of votes today, right? So what you can see clearly is a tendency of these two big parties losing votes and losing support, which means that other parties grow, right? And here, of course, we have to mention in the first place the Green Party that doubled its size, but nevertheless, I think you will agree with me that there's some disappointment, right? Because there was hope
Absolutely.
that the party would do even better than this. Can you give us some background on that?
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned correctly, there is an erosion among the so-called people's parties, Volksparteien, which are the CDU and the SPD, the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, and this has been ongoing for 2 decades now, I would say. And it's similar to other countries in Europe, that the big parties kind of lose votes. But what is really surprising, and one positive outcome of this election, which should be also mentioned here, is that the far right and the far left actually lost votes. So actually the shift of voters from mostly from CDU to SPD, but also among other parties, always remained in the middle of the political spectrum, so to speak. And this is actually quite positive. For the Greens, it was very disappointing, the result, since they had started really well. They had a really professional campaign and was for the first time really appealing for broader audiences, because they started out as a party that is really only interested in ecology. But if you want to run a government, you have to be seen as a party who can also speak about education, about finance, about everything basically. And this was the first attempt from their perspective to be seen as such a party that could be become the leading party in the coalition government. But due to the things that I mentioned earlier, they in the debates, we had presidential or chancellor debates and so on, they couldn't really make this claim successfully to the voters, and that's why they kind of got only 15% of, or less than 15% of the votes. And everybody agreed within the party that if it's less than 15%, it's actually very disappointing. Although I think last time they had only 8%, so actually their share increased significantly. As for the FDP, that is the Liberals, it is, I think, more positive, because they were thrown out of the parliament in 2013, I think. So they have not been in the parliament once for 4 years, but then got re-elected or integrated into the parliament again. They had more than 5%. Actually had 2-digit, and now it's the second time that they have 2-digit numbers in a row in terms of percentage of voters. So it's been very successful. They didn't have a candidate for chancellor as the Greens, so they started out much more modest in that sense, but have been very successful. And what also Akasemi already mentioned is that these two parties have been the most successful among the younger voters. And that's quite, I mean, for the Green Party, it's not so surprising with climate change, Fridays for Future, and all these political movements. But for the Liberals, that's actually quite surprising. And
how do you explain it, Soeren?
It's actually, I cannot explain it myself, and I actually had to look it up because I was really curious about it myself. And actually many of the political experts, and obviously I'm just a voter, not an expert, they also have no real clue. But what I found most convincing was, and this is really particular for the first generation voters, that is people who are 18 to 21, there they had the highest vote, and it's due to COVID policies, because they were the least restrictive. They said, we don't want to have a mask mandate, we want to reopen schools, we want to reopen businesses. So very liberal in that sense. I mean, liberal in the sense that we don't want to put restrictions on. And I mean, one of the generations most affected by the restrictions were people in school age, and also younger people who could not, live their lives as they would love to, basically. And I think that
a good point that you make is that maybe just one clarification for the audience. When we say the Liberal Party, what do we actually mean? Can you explain a little bit better what this party actually stands for?
That is very true. I mean, the Liberal Party is. We call it a Klientelpartei, which also means they have a small share. They are usually the party of entrepreneurs. It's not that they are liberal in all of their views, but they are very pro-economy, no tax or very few taxes. And for a long time, they have been part of a government, of a CDU and also SPD government in the past. And they have been like the spokespeople for, people in having businesses and so on. But therefore, their share has always been very, very small, like 5%, 7%, maybe 9%, but very few, on very few occasions, two-digit numbers. And I think they are also trying to appeal to broader audiences. And I think that also shows you that the CDU has been transformed by Angela Merkel in a way. I mean, the CDU moved further and further to the middle and actually towards the left. And what happened this time was that the CDU tried to move again further right to become the conservative party it used to be under Helmut Kohl and his predecessors. But the problem is that they could not really gain any votes in the conservative circles, so to speak, but they were not credible any longer to people in the middle. So people in the middle did not, because Merkel is gone, and many people voted for Merkel, but now these people went either to, especially the younger ones, went to the liberals or the Greens, and the older ones, and this is also an interesting finding, that for the first time, I don't know, in decades, the SPD, that this is Social Democrats, got the most voters from the people above 60. So, and if you look at numbers, people over 60 years old form 40% of all voters. So it's almost half the voters are, over 60 years old, which is quite, and that also shows you the generational conflict, so to speak, right? I mean, you have the young people being represented by the Liberals and the Green Party, and then you have the older generations in the other parties, so to speak.
And that's maybe an important point for us to discuss when we come to coalitions. Just one quick word about the two remaining parties, the far right and the far left. Both lose support, especially the far left, even less than 5%. Was that a surprise to you? Did you see it coming?
It was not a surprise in the sense that they will lose, but that they will be below 5% was quite a surprise to everybody. And it is related to, well, I think what happened was that the SPD, the Social Democrats, now speak again more to people in lower incomes, like of lower income. So they are feeling being more represented with the SPD. So people who we had the agenda reforms. Agenda 2010 was in the early 2000s reform where basically the social social market economy was reformed, and many of the benefits that people unemployed or with lower wages, the government got rid of these, and that's why people went to the left party instead of the Social Democrats. But now they are being more represented with the SPD. But another point is that many of their, how should I put it? I mean, their foreign policy agenda is simply unrealistic. They want to leave NATO. They want to have closer ties with Russia and China. And of course, there's people who like that idea, but I think the majority of potential voters don't like this idea. And also that very weak candidates. I mean, before that, they had a very charismatic candidate or like head of party, Gregor Gysi, who is a very well-known figure in German politics, but he was not running or was not head of this election campaign, so to speak.
And the far right, you see a decline in support, but still the party has about 10% of the vote, so it's still a political force in Germany.
Yes, it's still significant.
In the East, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's really a local thing, and I'm from the East. I'm always feel sorry if I see the political map, and especially where I come from, it's all blue because that's their color, and they have many of the first votes. That is the direct candidates being sent to the parliament in Saxony and other parts of East Germany. But why they failed was, I think, the biggest failure was that they really kind of put all the focus on the COVID and pandemic, and they were really anti-government in the sense that they said we want to end all restrictions, but many of the traditional voters, I mean, there's not really traditional voters for the AfD, it's a new party, but those who voted previously for them this was not the major issue. So it was not the strongest case they could make, and often they thought, okay, they are too crazy. They are like the really far right people, and so they could not appeal to broader parts of the conservative voters in Germany.
Just one last question then about the coalition, and then we will open the floor for questions from the audience. So just a reminder to everyone, if you have a question yourself, please write it down in the chat, and then we will have a chance to discuss it. But a word about the coalition, Soeren. Do you think that there is an alternative at all to what Akasemi just called, what is the traffic light?
And Jamaica.
SPD, FDP, and the Greens. To me, it seems the only serious option at this point. I don't see really much of an alternative.
Well, yeah, I mean, Akasemi pointed out that there's three possible coalitions. There's the grand coalition between the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, the People's Parties, the former People's Parties.
That's very unlikely, right?
That's very unlikely, especially because the CDU would be the junior partner,
exactly.
And from being having the chancellery to becoming the junior partner, it's a very difficult choice to make. But it's hard to predict, honestly, because the problem is that the FDP, that is the Liberals, have a very different take on how the state or the government should be run in the next 4 years. They are really they don't want to. We have this what is it called, the debt break. You cannot Germany cannot take more debt than the 3% of the BIP every year or so. And it's a very strict break, and they want to keep it that way.
Which is a problem for the Greens, of course.
Which is really the problem with the Greens and also with the SPD, because although Olaf Scholz has been the Minister of Finance before and has been very conservative, always they call it the black zero, the schwarze Null. They don't want to have any new debt. So, but he has become more open to that, especially if it comes to investments in the future, like energy, climate change, and stuff like that. So this will be the hardest point to negotiate between the Greens and the Liberals, basically. But the SPD is more on the side of the Greens. And also, what we should not underestimate is that Scholz within his party is a very conservative figure. So he's on the right edge of the SPD. And what usually happens when they negotiate a coalition agreement, the parties, that is the party members, have to vote on it. So if if it becomes too liberal, so if the Liberals get too many of their agenda items into this agreement, then they may actually vote against it. So that is the SPD. So this is really something that is tricky, I think. But what was interesting to see yesterday afternoon at German time at night, traditionally after the elections, once we have the first preliminary results, there's the so-called Elefantenrunde, round of the elephants, where all the heads of party come together in a TV studio. And it was really like a flirting going on between the Liberals were reaching out to the Greens and say, like Christian Lindner, the head of the Liberal Party, was basically saying, hey, let's sit down together and get together and find common ground. And then we'll basically go shopping and see who makes the better offer, the CDU or the SPD. And this is really interesting because the so-called small parties are not small anymore, because the Greens and the Liberals combined have more votes or more seats in the parliament than any of the big parties. So it's not, this discrepancy is not as big as it used to be anymore.
True. But how serious is the CDU still as a serious candidate here? Because most likely there will be there will be infighting in the party, there will be instability in the party.
Yes, absolutely. I mean,
there's already people asking for Laschet to step down, and
but surprisingly, his main opponent, who was also in this round of elephants yesterday, he was very friendly to him. So he tried to keep. I think what I don't really have a ready answer for that, but I think what happens is that they want to keep Laschet as long as this coalition negotiations are ongoing. So they have a scapegoat where something fails, they can, get rid of him. But this is my personal take on it. So I don't know. Yeah. And Laschet is very keen to become chancellor, and I think very willing to kind of make concessions, because his political career will be over if he's not becoming chancellor. He is still the head of state of North Rhine-Westphalia, but there's no way that he's going to go back to that state. So he will retire basically from politics if he's not becoming the chancellor. I think the biggest point of conflict between the Greens and the Liberals is who will get the Ministry of Finance, because who has a wallet can make politics within the government. So I think that's really something.
Who will pay for the Green Revolution? So
exactly.
Yeah. Very good. Excellent. I think we can open the floor for questions from the audience. And maybe Akasemi, we go back to you, and maybe you can read for us questions that have come up. And then either you or Soeren or I myself, we can follow up on these questions. So Akasemi, please.
So I see the first question is about the Green Party, and posed to all of us is whether we would say this election was a success for the Green Party, since it was one of their best election results of all times, considering again that they expected even higher results than they were able to achieve. So that's the first question from the audience member.
You want to follow up on that, Akasemi, yourself?
I'm happy to follow up on that. I would say that this was definitely a success for the Green Party, and I think their future beyond this term looks even brighter because of the way in which they so successfully reached younger voters and first-time voters. I think that the sort of first-time voters, their willingness to cast their sort of lot with the Greens, and also youth mobilization around issues of climate change, that coincides with the devastating floods that took place just earlier this summer in Western Germany. Unfortunately, because climate disasters are likely to continue with extreme weather events, the Greens are in a position to sort of maximize youth energy around climate issues to increase their share of the parliament. So I would say that, yes, it was a successful event. I don't know, Soeren.
Can I disagree? Is it okay to disagree?
Of course.
Of course.
We're in Berkeley. You're famous.
Okay. Well, I think, Akasemi, you're absolutely right. But I think the problem is the numbers of voters and the shares. I mean, they already the younger generation already makes the case. We have climate change. We must act now. And, it was a perfect setting for a victory of the Green Party. We had this flood right before the elections. I mean, who could have hoped for that? I mean, as strange as it may sound, but from a party perspective, it was, just in time. But I mean, as I said, the share of the younger voters is very small, and it's not getting bigger in the future. And I think the only chance the Green Party has, if it comes into government now, and this is very likely that it will be part of the government, that they can show convincingly to other voters, that older voters, also maybe more conservative voters, that they actually can efficiently run and successfully run a government, then they will appeal to border circles with other fields of politics. And then this could be a success for them in the future election. But I think climate change, that has been, since they exist, the point they make, and there's just so much you can get votes from people for that. And there's many other issues that seem for people more pressing, unless the forest behind your house is burning, they think about other issues mostly, unfortunately. But yeah, that's
well, the question that comes to my mind is how to interpret, right, this success among young voters. And there's two possible ways to read this, I think. One way is to say it's only a matter of time, so to speak, for the Green Party to become larger and larger, because the young people who voted now for the Green Party will get older, and new young people will come in, and then gradually it will become the largest party in Germany over time. So they just have to sit back and wait, and ultimately they will inevitably become the largest party. But a different reading would be that as soon as people in their lives are no longer students, right? They want to have a house, they have a family, they want to make a living with their salary. Maybe then other priorities come up. So that it may well be that people who are in their youth, very enthusiastic about the Green Party, when their lives changes, right? Then maybe at that point other priorities come up, and maybe then at that point the welfare state is a higher priority than the Green Revolution. That's a different reading of that.
Absolutely.
Result, right?
Yeah.
But I see that we also have another question from Albert. Shall we go back to you, Akasemi?
Sure, and this actually dovetails nicely with the second question from the first respondent. So how do you explain the success of the AfD among younger voters? And, could we say something about the other state elections, specifically the AfD, and how it consolidated its leading position in Saxony and Thuringia? I can respond briefly, and then I'll let you have your insight. So from what I've seen of the coverage and scholarly research on the AfD, the AfD is a very polarizing party around the issue specifically of migration. And to some extent, what we see distinct in this German election cycle from, for example, some of the recent Scandinavian elections is that migration has been sort of diffused as a political issue to some extent. And so you have this electorate that is more diverse, with a quarter of the population having a migration background, and about 12% of voters having a migration background. So this polarizing issue has turned off those many voters with the migration background, the youth, and those in general who do not like this single issue approach of the AfD, to say the least. So the AfD was not successful among younger voters in this round. Concerning its position in Saxony and Thuringia, just to echo Soeren, we've seen that the AfD is indeed a regional party, though it has made some inroads among voters, older voters in West Germany. It's still a distinctly regional party, attracting a lot of support among voters in the former East Germany. That said, there were also regional elections in Berlin, where the SPD, won the majority of the state seats there. But then Berlin is also, an outlier as the capital city. Soeren.
It's an interesting question, I think, for Soeren, right? Since you come from Eastern Germany and you know the area quite well. When looking at regional elections, Soeren, also in the eastern part, right, in Berlin and Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, where we saw that the AfD actually lost considerably. But then we see the results in Saxony and Thuringia that are different. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, I was actually going to start with Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, which is the northernmost state of East Germany, where the SPD, the Social Democrats, just won a landslide victory of, I think, 40% of the voters. Yeah. So it's like a people's party again. So, and the CDU lost, but also the AfD lost. So for me, it is a big kind of mystery, honestly, because if you would think, okay, a party like the AfD, who is far right, anti-immigration, anti-establishment party in a way, would get the most votes in places like that are economically disadvantaged. And if you look at East Germany, the economically most disadvantaged parts are the north of East Germany and the Saxony-Anhalt, which is in the middle somewhere. But not Thuringia and Saxony, which are traditionally industrialized regions and fare better economically speaking, with less unemployment and more higher incomes than the rest of East Germany. So there's a different story to that, and I think it has become really established in that sense that people have gained votes, have gained seats, and become the new political establishment in these regions, and is increasingly becoming detached from economic questions or a migration crisis, quote unquote. This is the only explanation that I have, and it's very unfortunate that this is the case, because it is increasingly difficult to kind of regain these regions for democratic parties, because it's part of the it's becoming basically part of the establishment, the political establishment.
Yeah. I don't see any new questions from the audience at the moment, so let me turn to both of you perhaps with an interesting comment I saw in the New York Times today, essentially arguing that also from an international perspective, there is concern about Germany becoming more unstable in the coming months, and with not a clear winner, not a clear strong figure following Merkel as head of state. Is that a concern you share? That it will take a very long time to build a government, and that even after this government is in place, it may be unstable, there may be infighting between the coalition partners. What is your prediction? Maybe Akasemi first and then Soeren?
Sure, Jeroen. I mean, I think certainly given that we had 16 years of Merkel's, leadership in the heart of Europe and on the international stage, there's a lot of sort of reasonable concern that, the next government will face some challenges in terms of replicating that sort of leadership. I mean, as we all know, Angela Merkel steered Germany and the EU through, for example, the Russian aggression in the Ukraine, through the Euro crisis, the refugee crisis, and then also, the Corona crisis, which is still unfolding. And I think perhaps time will tell kind of what her most important steps were on the international stage. But I would argue potentially for the Europe bonds in response to the economic crisis brought on by Corona, in which EU member states came together to issue shared debt that many have hailed as the potential Hamiltonian moment of the EU. And so I think some concern is warranted, given the divide that Soeren and you alluded to between the sort of conservative within the SPD approach of Olaf Scholz and the eagerness of the Greens to really invest in sort of climate infrastructure, that will be able to respond to the climate change disasters that we see. I think this is going to be a real challenge, this divide between the SPD and the Greens, but we will have to see.
And probably Soeren also within the SPD, right? Because you have large differences also between more moderate figures like Scholz and then people more on the left who are
And he's not the head of the party, one should say.
Exactly.
And the two heads of party, there's
much more to the left
are much more to the left. So, but I think he has now much more liberty because he has won it's everybody agrees that it was his victory. So within the party, at least at the moment, he has a very strong position, even against these more left-leaning circles. But what I wanted to mention regarding Germany's role in Europe and in the world and with the new leadership, I think what struck me during the election campaign, like foreign policy, EU was completely absent. It was a totally inward-looking campaign from all the parties, and also the media. So we had, like, I think three, they call it trial, where the three main candidates were running, were being interviewed, and none of the question was foreign policy related. So, which is really striking, also, and very disappointing for not only for other European countries, but also for Germans being interested in foreign policy, because it was hard to grasp what was on their agenda. I think what everybody knows now, or what everybody agrees on among those people who are now being asked to form the new coalition government, is that they have the bad experience of 2017, where it took really long to form a government and they failed and they had to start all over again. So what they said, everybody of the party leaders said yesterday, we have to be quick in forming a new government. So at least there is this, people are aware of that problem. Also next year, I think Germany is having the presidency of the G7, and also Germany will, or politicians in Germany are aware that if there will not be kind of a strong figure as a head of government or in the foreign ministry and other important ministries, soon others will fill the gap. I mean, by others, I mean other countries in Europe, especially the French president. So there's also like a goal of kind of being stable again as a government, as a state, as a country. But whether this will happen or not, we don't know yet, simply. And I think what we should also not forget is that 16 years ago, when Angela Merkel became the chancellor, she was a really, really weak figure. And, Gerhard Schröder, who was the chancellor until then, was making jokes about her right after the election, that she will never be able to run a government. And, which means that we may perceive some figures as weak today, but we don't know how they will be seen in 4 years or 10 years from now, if there is a government that is, or like a chancellor they'll be in office for so long time. But I don't know. Simply, it's hard to.
Thank you, Soeren. I see that our dear colleague Gia White just posted a question, which I think is an important question, about the long-lasting appeal, like the legacy of Merkel. And I definitely think it's worth also us having a brief discussion about that. Maybe Akasemi, thinking about the long-lasting legacy of Merkel, what comes to your mind first?
Well, I think her leadership in the face of multiple overlapping crises, certainly. I think that, sort of books have been written about that, the multiple crises. I saw a headline that said there are many babies born this year with the name for girls of Angela in Germany, or Merkel for boys. And many of these are babies born to refugee parents. They're so grateful that they had the chance to have a new start in Germany. So I think her response to crises, absolutely. I think another legacy she has in the domestic realm has to do with her consensual style of politics. She was very good at building consensus, and some detractors would say she was very good at stealing the ideas of her opponents. And so in some ways that the SPD was able to come back and gain and sort of outplay the CDU in getting the largest share of votes was a real handicap that they had to overcome, because Merkel had taken so many of their domestic policy ideas, such as raising the minimum wage or increasing pensions, and implemented them in a way that increased the appeal of the CDU, while sort of blurring the image of what the SPD stood for. So certainly her behavior in crisis, and then her ability to work with other partners, I think, are going to form a big part of her legacy.
Would you agree, Soeren?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, and she has been like a chameleon in a sense, that she was able to hear what people wanted, and also she was within her party in such a strong position that she could even implement policies that were running completely against the CDU policy, like what we call homo ehe, that that everybody can marry. It's not just men and women, but men and men and women and women, which is absolutely, from their perspective, a no-go, so to speak. But it was possible, and she did not vote for it, but she left it open to vote in parliament. So she always adopted, and also the end of the military service, compulsory military service was during her government. Then Fukushima, the end of atomic energy in Germany. She was a strong supporter of nuclear power in Germany until then, and until March 2011. And then all of a sudden she said, no, we're gonna leave that. We're gonna end nuclear power. So in that sense, she was very successful. But also, what I think what one should not underestimate, like, Germans don't like change, and they like boring politicians in a sense. I mean, it may be like not the right wording for that, or not very nice to her, but actually in a sense she was, and she actually made once the case, I think, in the previous election, during the last interview. She said they always have the final statement, the politicians, before the show ends, and what she said was, "You know me, so please vote for me." So you know me already, and I think it was Scholz that used this card this time, and he was very successful in that.
That's a very interesting idea. But would you then say, just as a final question for you, Soeren, would you say that had she run again, do you think that she would have made it, or do you think Germany is at the moment where it says, now we want to move on with someone new? What do you think?
It's a good question. I think, I mean, now people say there was like a moment of change that people wanted to change, but this was also because her successor was so weak, her potential, like Armin Laschet, and it's hard to predict how. I mean, it would have been difficult to make this case, because the last time she ran again, she said, I actually don't want to run, but because of the ongoing crisis, and because of Trump and things like that, she said she was asked to run again. Whether this is true or not, I don't know. But her case would have been more difficult. But what is also important is that she would then be having the 5th term, and none of her predecessors has had 5 terms. I mean, Kohl and Adenauer also had 4 terms, but I mean, 16 years is really a long time.
Because many of the young voters,
I mean, they just
never really lived in Germany with a different head of state. Excellent. I see it is 12:57. A quick question and a quick answer, because we'll have to close at 1 p.m. Sharp. Akasemi, do you want to read the question that Matthew just posted?
Sure. Did any of the other parties sound a moral alarm about the AfD or the AfD? And if so, were those warnings effective, or did the AfD's limited success due to waning of migration as the leading issue, or other factors? So did the AfD really lose its appeal due to the loss of migration as kind of as potent?
So we only have 2 minutes. A very quick answer. Maybe Akasemi, you first, and then Soeren.
I would say that the natural sort of ability of the AfD to kind of really make migration the key issue was really overwhelmed by the corona crisis. And there was a real sort of pulling together across parties to get the country through the crisis. And though not initially, eventually to even work with European partners on addressing the disease and the pandemic. So I would say it was really other factors.
Good point. Soeren, would you agree?
I absolutely agree. And I would like to add just one thing, that in the previous election, everybody was like, all the other parties were warning, don't vote for AfD. But this time, the AfD didn't play a big role in the political discourse ahead of the elections. So this didn't help to mobilize their own voters. If everybody is, against you, then you would probably go and, vote. And this time, many people probably just didn't go voting, I think.
I see there's more questions. Oh, I just see a thank you from Albert. That's very kind of Albert. But I also want to thank my dear colleague Akasemi Newsome. Big thank you also to Soeren Urbansky, A big thank you to Ray, who behind the scenes made everything possible, and to you in the audience for joining us today, either on YouTube or here in the Zoom meeting. I think we had a very engaged but very interesting discussion on the results of the election in Germany. So a big thank you to all of you, and I look forward to seeing you